On March 25, 1944, the bodies of two young white girls were found in a ditch in Ockaloo, South Carolina. Their names were Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7. They'd been reported missing the day before by their parents, and a community-wide search for the two girls ensued. Apparently, on the day before, on March 24th, the two girls had crossed the railroad tracks into the African-American section of Ockaloo, South Carolina, from the white section of Ockaloo, South Carolina. And when they crossed over the tracks, they had stopped at the property of the Stinney family and talked to George Stinney, age 14, and his sister Amy. Because George Stinney was one of the last people to see these girls left alive, when their bodies were found, suspicion naturally fell on he and his older brother Johnny. These two young African-American men were taken into custody by the police, but Johnny was released in part largely because, according to one of the arresting officers, George Stinney had confessed to the murder of these two girls. The only record of that confession were the notes taken by that policeman. Another confession was extracted from George Stinney later on, but both questionings and both confessions were not signed. Neither confession was given in the presence of a lawyer. Neither confession was given, and none of the question was done in the presence of George Stinney's parents. And in addition to that, George Stinney claimed the policeman had refused to feed him until he agreed to sign a confession. A month later, in April of 1944, George Stinney's trial took place. That trial lasted exactly one day. That included a jury selection in the morning and a 2-hour trial later that day. During that 2-hour trial, George Stinney was represented by a court-appointed defense attorney whose primary expertise was in real estate law. That man who was defending George Stinney was also running for elected office in Ockaloo, South Carolina, and therefore was unlikely to feel any motivation to mount a defense for young George Stinney. The prosecution presented the coroner's evidence, which described how the two young girls had been killed. The arresting officers and the other police officers all gave testimony, and all the testimony and evidence entered in the case lasted for 2 hours. And during that 2 hours, George Stinney's defense attorney did not call any witnesses. He did not offer any objections to the fact that two confessions supposedly gotten from George Stinney didn't match up in a lot of substantive ways. He didn't object to the fact that Stinney had been questioned without the presence of counsel or his parents. He essentially didn't do anything. When the jury was sent out to deliberate and make their verdict, they returned in less than 10 minutes with a verdict of guilty. They found George Stinney, an African-American young man, age 14, guilty of both murders. The judge in the case sentenced George Stinney to death by electrocution, and then in June of 1944, George Stinney's date of electrocution arrived. It was on that day that George Stinney's father was allowed to see him for the first time since George Stinney had been arrested. When the prison officials came to take George Stinney from his cell to the execution chamber, to the electric chair, 3 police officers escorted Stinney, who was 5'1" and weighed 90 pounds at the time, to the electric chair. Stinney carried with him a Bible in his hand. When they put George Stinney in the electric chair, in the beginning he wasn't tall enough for the straps or the equipment necessary to provide the lethal electrical charge to fit, so they had him sit on the Bible, the very Bible he'd brought with him for comfort, to boost him up, to make him tall enough for electrocution. They strapped his arms and legs down. They pulled a strap across his mouth. They put a mask over his face so that the witnesses didn't have to see the tortured expressions on his face. And then they attached the electrodes. They flipped the switch, and 8 minutes later, George Stinney was pronounced dead. Because Stinney was so small, the mask had slipped from his face, revealing a tear-streaked face and a severely charred scalp. George Stinney is the youngest man to be officially executed in the history of the United States of America. In 2014, an amicus curiae brief was lodged with a federal appeals court. That appeals court overturned George Stinney's conviction for murder, saying he had been denied the right to a fair trial. But by then, Stinney had been dead for 70 years. In the summer of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till boarded a southbound train from Chicago to go spend the summer with his great-uncle Moses Wright in Money, Mississippi. He arrived there and spent part of the summer playing and fishing with his cousins. One day Emmett Till and his cousins went into the Bryant grocery store where allegedly Emmett Till, on his way out of the store, whistled at the white proprietor of the store, Carolyn Bryant. A few days later, in the middle of the night, a group of white men came to Moses Wright's home and demanded that Emmett Till get dressed and come with them. Moses Wright and his wife begged that they not take Emmett Till away, but they had a gun, and so they took, the men had a gun, so they took Till away. The white men took Emmett Till west and severely beat him and then killed him. They threw his body in the river, weighted down with a 75-pound fan from a cotton gin, assuming no one would ever find the body and there would never be any questions asked about what happened to Emmett Till. But fishermen did find his body a few days later. His body was sent north to his mother in Chicago, where she had an open casket funeral so that everybody could see exactly how disfigured Emmett Till was and how disfigured he had been and the severe beating he'd received and the cruel treatment that he'd received. That open casket funeral made headlines and drew attention to what was happening in Mississippi in the 1950s. When the men responsible for kidnapping and killing Emmett Till were brought to trial, Moses Wright courageously stood up in court and identified the men who came to his house to kidnap his nephew. An all-white jury took 67 minutes to return a not guilty verdict against all of those men, and they were able to walk free. Later, many of those men confessed to the murder in a magazine article, and much later, Carolyn Bryant confessed that Till had really done nothing wrong, that she had exaggerated the events for effect. Emmett Till was 14. On November 22, 2014, a 12-year-old African-American boy named Tamir Rice was playing with a toy gun in a Cleveland park. A call went in to the 911 dispatch for the Cleveland Police Department saying that there was a man with a gun threatening people, pointing the gun at people in the park. The 911 dispatcher asked several questions, including repeatedly the race of the man with the gun. The caller who called in the call repeatedly said that it was possible that the man was actually a child and that it was possible that the gun was actually a toy. The 911 dispatcher reported there was an active shooter in the park. 10 minutes later, a police car containing 2 Cleveland police officers roared into the park very close to the place where Tamir Rice was sitting under a gazebo. Within 2 seconds of arriving, one of the police officers had fired his weapon twice at Tamir Rice, hitting him in the stomach once. That policeman claimed that he had gotten out of the car and repeatedly told Tamir Rice to put his hands up, and that Rice had reached for his waistband, which is where the toy gun was located, and only then the officer opened fire. Later, security camera footage surfaced that proved that this was not true, that the officer had not really gotten out of his car. The car had barely come to a stop before Tamir Rice was shot in the stomach. And witnesses who were called to give grand jury testimony later testified that they didn't hear the officer shouting, "Put your hands up." The officer stood over Tamir Rice's bleeding body for 4 minutes without rendering any kind of first aid. An FBI agent, who was actually investigating a case nearby, came to the scene and administered first aid to Tamir Rice for 3 minutes until the EMTs finally showed up. In the meantime, Tamir Rice's teenage sister, who was also in the park, ran to the scene because she'd seen her brother shot and was worried that he was dead. One of the 2 officers who was first on the scene tackled her to the ground, wrestled with her, injuring her wrist, and then arrested her and had her detained, all while her brother was bleeding. Tamir Rice died the next day in the hospital. Later, when the case was taken before a grand jury, the grand jury refused to indict the police officers involved, believing the 2 officers had been in fear of their lives. Those 2 officers were returned to work, as was the dispatch officer, and no one was ever prosecuted. Tamir Rice was 12.